First of all, I wanted to say thank you to all of our amazing partners that helped us pass this legislation in New York State. We had so many organizations working together for this important legislation. As you can see, it's a great group of environmental justice organizations and environmental and climate organizations that found that this was a very important bill to ultimately see move forward to protect communities of color and low income across the state. So thank you to all of our amazing partners. We couldn't have done it without you all. So before we jump into the description of the legislation, I'd love to give our two co-leaders that worked on this bill with us a minute to give their introductory remarks. So first, I'd love to call up Arif Ullah, who is the Executive Director of South Bronx Unite.
Thank you, Sonal. Really happy to be here with all of you. Seems like a national crowd here, and very much looking forward to the panel as well. So South Bronx, this is a piece of legislation that will be a lifesaver for our community, literally a lifesaver. We have been dealing with the impacts of redlining, the racist urban policies, urban renewal programs, disproportionate siting of polluting facilities for many decades. And this legislation would prevent the siting of those types of facilities in communities like ours across New York State. And that will result in better health outcomes for us. We in the South Bronx have been grappling for decades with high rates of childhood asthma hospitalization, higher than any other part of the country. And we also know now that exposure to air pollution also is correlated with a host of health issues, including dementia, including infant mortality, including obesity, including diabetes. The list goes on. And so for us, this is a critical piece of legislation. We have been really grateful to work with WeAct and so many other great organizations on this initiative. And now we need to get it across the finish line. We need to make sure that the governor signs it. This is a critical piece of legislation. And so we are looking forward to working with all of you to make sure that it is signed into law. So thank you, Sonal, for this opportunity to speak. Very much looking forward to the panel.
Thank you so much, Arif. And I would like to hand it over to our other co-leader, Paul Webster, who is the Director of Programs at Clean Healthy New York, and also co-chairs our JustGreen Partnership.
Good morning and welcome, and thank you, Sonal, and thank you, Arif. And this is a great victory for New York's environmental movement, and not just New York, but the whole country. As we talk about our bill, S8830, Stuart Cousins, and A2103, Pretlow. And it was just wonderful when it passed both houses during our Earth Day Advocacy Day that week. And we are delighted that our legislation had 65 sponsors in both the Senate and Assembly, and hopefully we'll hear from some of them today. And this will be significant, as Arif said, as Sonal mentioned, in terms of dealing with the racist policies, the health disparities, poverty, and communities from across the state, from Brookhaven to Buffalo, are going to benefit from this, especially our poor Black and Brown communities in our upstate cities like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Albany, and down into the Hudson Valley. So this is a great day, and we need Governor Kathy Hochul to sign this legislation now. Sonal?
Thank you very much, Paul, for your remarks. And so before we hear from a couple of our representatives, I wanted to do a quick overview of what is this legislation that passed in New York. So this bill passed, as we said, in the end of April, and it was sponsored by Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins and Assemblymember Pretlow in the New York State Legislature. And so this bill is addressing the issue of cumulative impacts. So For those of you who do not know, cumulative impacts in general is this idea that communities are exposed disproportionately to environmental hazards or public health hazards because they are living in a space that might have some accumulation of many polluting sources. And so in a place like Northern Manhattan, for example, that means one neighborhood is home to so many sources of toxic air or pollution that might pollute our waters as well, such as we have a substation, we have bus depots, we have train yards, we have truck parking lots, and all of these things are in just a small concentration of space. And therefore what we see is air pollution from in those communities. And what that means is that we see worse health outcomes, such as higher risk of cardiovascular illness and more. And so what we are doing by working on cumulative impacts is that we are saying that it is not only important to consider how one facility contributes to poor environmental hazards or public health hazards, but how the culmination of all of these facilities together is creating that toxic soup of and so that is our big concern with cumulative impacts. So this legislation, a very brief, broad overview, essentially says that if a facility wants to site in what we call a disadvantaged community in New York State, they must undergo a report where they assess how the facility is contributing to a cumulative burden. So contributing to maybe some existing environmental and public health burdens in that neighborhood in a disadvantaged community in New York State. And if they are, then their permit should be denied and they have to find either somewhere else to site or have to be a cleaner facility that's not polluting as much, not contributing to this existing burden. And the overall point of this legislation is that it is these disadvantaged communities, which are low-income communities and communities of color, that have been disproportionately exposed to toxic facilities and toxic exposures in their neighborhoods. And this legislation is taking a big step in stopping this disproportionate siting in communities. It's saying no more do communities of color and low income need to be the dumping grounds for toxic pollution in our communities. And that is the general overview of this legislation that we're talking about today. And we will be joined by a panel that is not only talking about this New York legislation, but talking about what it means to do this type of work, pass bills like this across the state, and work on how the federal government is considering cumulative impacts in their work as well. So it will be a really fun discussion. Before we move into the panel, I would like to we have two representatives here to make some short statements about the importance of the legislation. First, I'd like to call up Assemblywoman Jessica Gonzalez Rojas, who is here. She represents Queens and is a chair of the Environmental Justice Subcommittee at the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Caucus in New York, in the New York State Legislature. And so we'd love to have her come up and just give us a short statement about the importance of this legislation.
Thank you, Sonal. Thank you, everyone who helped make this happen. So I want to actually give everyone a round of applause because I come to this work as an activist, an advocate, and now on the inside, I see what it's like and how meaningful it is to have advocates like you, activists, experts, scientists, organizers, coming up to Albany, speaking truth to power, pushing on issues that are vitally important. And as was mentioned, I am the assembly member for the 34th Assembly District, representing neighborhoods of Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona Woodside. And I will also be inheriting North Astoria after the redistricting process goes into effect, which is next year, which is inclusive of the NRG plant in Astoria. So I know firsthand what it's like to have polluting entities in our communities, impacting communities of color. My district right now is 88% people of color. 88% people of color. So, you know, we know how, you know, a policy like this is actually going to change the lives of our community members, our children, our grandchildren, and the next 7 generations. So we have a long way to go to actually achieve the goals of the CLCPA, but this was an important step forward. And honestly and wholeheartedly, we could not have done it without you. It is, again, your advocacy, your persistence, your tenacity that got us here. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the Bill Public Renewables Act over the line or the All Electric Building Act, but we pushed like hell, and then we're trying to lay the groundwork to really see those pieces of legislation move forward, as well as a CCIA, which we all know is the kind of teeth behind the CLCPA that we also need as well. So lots more to do, but I am a believer of celebration and I'm a believer of finding joy even in the darkest and most difficult moments. And this is a joyous celebration. And again, I just want to thank you for your leadership, and just know that this means that we're going to be able to save lives in communities of color, those that have been disproportionately impacted by the harms of environmental racism. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So good to see so many friends here, and let's celebrate, but tomorrow let's get back to the fight and keep pushing for next session.
Thank you so much, Assemblywoman Gonzalez-Rojas, for being here and for all of your support. We very much appreciate your championship of this legislation and other environmental justice legislation. Next, we will have a video. Our representative, Carolyn Maloney, could not join us today, but she recorded a video of her remarks talking about the importance of this legislation, not only for New York, but nationally. So I will play that recording now.
Thank you so much to We Act for Environmental Justice for having me today. Earlier this spring, I was thrilled to hear that the New York State Legislature passed a bill to ensure that cumulative impacts are considered under the state's environmental quality review process. Low-income communities and communities of color have been subjected to unending toxic pollution for too long, and it's time for the state to consider that. Within my district is Ravenswood Generating Station, the most polluting power plant in New York State, which includes a dangerous smokestack called Big Alice. But it's not just my district that is in harm's way. Across New York City, there are 89 peaker units across 19 power plants. 11 of these peaker units are in my district, and 17 more are just blocks away. These units are killing my constituents and must be stopped. It's the reason why my area in Queens is called Asthma Alley, because of the high concentration of pollutants in one area. And that is why I was so happy to hear that the New York State Legislature passed this critical cumulative impacts bill. It's also why earlier this year I introduced the Justice and Power Plant Permitting Act. This legislation will bar major sources of air pollution, including Big Alice and peakers, from being permitted when they harm the health and well-being of our communities. It would do so through a cumulative impacts analysis, which requires the emissions of a power plant or boiler to be considered alongside the other sources of air pollution impacting a community. The legislation also creates a $10 billion Just Energy Transition Fund to provide funding for clean energy projects to replace plants whose permits are denied. Finally, the bill ensures the federal government is a partner in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and hazardous air pollutants by requiring 100% renewable air pollution-free energy use by 2030. As a city, state, and nation, we must move away from these dangerous plants. We cannot address the effects of climate change unless we do something bold and comprehensive to get rid of the actual polluters. And I am so excited to be part of that fair and important effort. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you very much to Representative Maloney for her remarks in support of a very exciting New York legislation and talking about how this impacts our cumulative impacts work nationwide. So now, without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our panel that is here today to talk about how cumulative impacts is not only important for New York State, but how we've gone through this journey in other states and are continuing this work nationally. So I'd love to introduce our 4 panelists. We have Peggy Shepard, the Executive Director and co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice, where of course I work. And then we have Mychal Johnson, who is the co-founder of South Bronx Unite and a great advocate for the South Bronx. We have Dr. Robert Bullard, Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy and Director of the Bullard Center for Environment and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University. And we have Dr. Nicky Sheats, Director of the Center for Urban Environment at the John S. Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research at Kean University. And he is one of the founding members of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. So thank you to the 4 of you for joining us. And I would like to start with just hearing 1 to 2 minutes from each of you about why is this cumulative impacts legislation important? Why does this matter? And Peggy, we will start with you.
Sure. You know, the environmental justice movement has always had a strong focus on cumulative impacts and also on the permitting process. Permitting is at the bedrock of the challenges that so many of our communities face. Really, what a permit does is give a polluter permission to pollute within a regulatory standard that has been set for air, water, and soil. And so when we have multiple facilities in one small community that are all, with many of them, of course, not in compliance, but when you have the aggregate of all of those facilities, we understand that there's an important contribution there to the glaring health disparities that we see in our communities, and that those disparities continue to escalate. So really being able to have this bill that will begin to force more considerations of these permits, looking at the health of a community, looking at a number of metrics, will be very, very important for us to begin to really address the legacy of pollution in our communities.
Thank you, Peggy. I'd like to hand it to Dr. Bullard to also make your comments about why this is important as someone who's been doing this work for so long.
Well, first of all, thanks for asking me to join this panel, and congratulations, New York. We love to see progressive states take the lead. It's important not just for residents of New York State, but having New York pass legislation, and hopefully the governor sign it, sets leadership. And that type of leadership can trickle up, because we know that when states take action on their own, it can also have a ripple effect in seeing that other states may join this. When we talk about the issue of cumulative impact, this is a 4-decade struggle because communities on the ground who live 24/7 with pollution, with the impact of compromised health, not only does pollution steal health, it also steals wealth in terms of lowering property values, diminishing the quality of life. And so it's important that when you pass legislation like this, it will have a multiplier effect in terms of improving the quality of life and also addressing issues, not just climate, but also health and well-being. So I want to give a shout out to New York State, and to keep this trajectory of leading, and we'll see that type of leadership, as I said before, can have national implications. And like the WEJAC that I serve on, and that Nicky serves on, and Peggy serves on as a co-chair, that we can see states taking that leadership on cumulative impact as well as climate. So go forth and celebrate, but don't celebrate too long, because we got a lot of work still to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bullard. We will definitely make sure we have to turn around and continue our work tomorrow after celebrating. I'd love to ask Mychal Johnson from South Bronx Unite to tell us why this is important.
Thank you, Sonal. First of all, thank you all for coming to this momentous panel discussion on such important legislation that should not only affect New York State, but the entire country. I'm honored to be on this panel with these environmental justice giants. We always talk about how we stand on the shoulders of our giants. I'm sitting on the panel with 3 of them. Why is this important? 1 in 5 of our children have asthma. Why do they have asthma? Why do we have such poor health consequences in the South Bronx? Because we've been zoned for it. We have the fossil fuel power plants. We have the waste transfer stations that handle all of the Bronx waste in one neighborhood. We have 3 highways that encircle us. We have 5 bridges intersecting with us. We have the largest significant maritime industrial area in the city of New York. So it's no clue why we have so much burden or so much poor health. We always look at these projects in one project at a time. We look at the highways, how they're being enhanced, how Robert Moses started off the Cross Bronx Expressway and kept on moving. How we look at one fossil fuel power plant put here by Pataki 20 years ago as temporary installations. How we look at one heavily financed private industry moving to the South Bronx 10 years ago, bringing 1,000 diesel truckers to our community every day with state fundings of about $250 million. And relying on an environmental impact statement more than 20 years old to say it's okay to do it. Our laws have not protected our community. Our children deserve the right to breathe fresh air, to live healthy lives, and it shouldn't matter of the color of their skin or their income level. You can look at New York City as a sampling. When you look at the South Bronx versus what's happening in other communities, there's this vast disparity of access to clean air, to green space, to higher life expectancy, all because we've been zoned for it. All because we are the place where you put these types of sightings. This legislation is so important that right now, before this panel started, I heard the rehearsal for our graduation class from a local public school a block away from me, where they're in their playground preparing for their graduation. How many of those children did not make the graduation? How many of those children are left behind because they have high rates of asthma hospitalization and absenteeism where they couldn't meet the standards in which they could graduate, or they didn't live to meet graduation? This legislation is life-saving, and we need to strengthen our laws to save our community. It can't be about economic development and job creation alone. That's been the precursor for all the harm that's happened here and in our communities around the nation. We're going to create economic development, we're going to create jobs, it's going to benefit everybody. But we're going to be the ones who suffer because all we get from those developments is the fumes coming from the trucks and the exhaust coming from those peaker plants. So I'll leave it there and we have more to talk about. But this is so important for us to stop this cycle. That's how we explain it to our community. It's not, they don't know what you mean by cumulative environmental impact. No, we're trying to stop the cycle. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mychal. Always amazing to hear how South Bronx is impacted. So thank you. I'd love to hand it over to Dr. Nicky Sheats to talk about why this is important and coming from the perspective of someone who has recently had this win in New Jersey. So we're very excited to have you. And you're on mute.
You think by now I would know better. Thanks, Sona. I want to talk about why these 2 pieces of legislation are breakthrough. First, let me echo the words, though, of Dr. Bullard and Peggy. The EJ community nationwide and in New Jersey, we've been working on this issue for so long. And it's really, I won't say it's the culmination, because like Dr. Bullard said, we still need to do more, but it's certainly a high point so far. We formed our first Cumulative Impacts Committee, the New Jersey EJ Committee in New Jersey in 2007. And as Peggy said, particularly in the context of permitting, right? We've been struggling with this issue, and it took the 2020. Well, our legislation was passed in 2020. It took all those years, those decades, for us to get legislation that finally said that under certain circumstances, application for pollution permits shall be denied based on cumulative impacts and environmental justice. And in New Jersey, those circumstances, the law says that if granting the application application for the permit would make public health and environmental stressors higher in the neighborhood where the facility would be located than in other communities, then the application shall be denied. The New York legislation, from my understanding, can be even stronger if the governor will sign it, of course, as is. And one reason why these are such breakthroughs is that I know I was really worried that for years, we were going to be stuck in the analysis phase, where we'd be doing a lot of cumulative impact analysis, a lot of tools were being developed to identify communities with high levels of cumulative impacts, but we weren't taking that next step, which is the policy that will actually result in real pollution reductions in environmental justice communities. And that's what these two pieces of legislation represent. They represent that breakthrough that will actually, as other folks have said, actually save lives, go beyond the analysis and start reducing pollution. And other states hopefully will follow through. We know EJ communities in like New Mexico and Delaware are working on it. Hopefully it will go up, as Professor Bullard said, to the national level. And let me just say again, though, as happy as we are, we recognize that these two pieces of legislation are not silver bullets, and they still need to be complemented with other strategies and other policies so we have coherent cumulative impact policies to fully address the cumulative impact problems in our communities. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Sona.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so I'd love to ask a question of really all of you as national leaders in this work. The EPA has begun to talk about cumulative impacts and is considering the concept of cumulative impacts in their work. How do you think they're doing? What are they missing? What will this bill in New York State do to help move that national agenda forward? And I'm happy to hear anyone that wants to start with their answer.
Well, you know, the EPA has quietly, as they're beginning to engage in the rulemaking process, they've quietly asked their research and development department to begin to look at the impact of decisions that they're making through a racial lens, to develop a framework to answer a number of questions that that EPA is asking them. They really want R&D to develop a cumulative risk assessment framework so that they can begin to apply that framework to rulemaking. So we'll see how this goes. I don't know what the timetable is for this. This was announced, I guess, about a month ago, but at least they're beginning to move. And this bill will help. But what has really gotten us to this place is people on this call and the rest of the environmental justice movement, which has been pressuring EPA for decades, and certainly pressuring our new EPA administrator, Michael Regan, to focus on this. So I think to a lot of us, what EPA does in coming out on cumulative impact is really going to be a key metric of how they advance environmental justice and whether we feel that they're effective. So that's what I know about what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's important, just to echo what Peggy said, I think it's important that most communities that are disproportionately impacted and are considered environmental sacrifice zones or over polluted, a lot of them look to the EPA. Even though the EPA may not necessarily be the final place where a lot of the regulatory authority may rest, I do think that EPA has a major leadership role. A lot of it is DOT and Partner Energy. You start naming the different agencies that have some type of responsibility. But EPA has always been the agency that has stepped out a little bit further when it comes to environmental justice. So building in cumulative impact assessment into regulatory regime is very important. And to have a number of states that also step up, and there are at least about a dozen states now that are at some level in their process of having cumulative impact assessments and teeth that can somehow be used to stop or ratchet down types of pollution. So it gives so looking at New York State, New Jersey, and California, Oregon, Washington State, Michigan, Vermont, Ohio, having states like that, like those, to come up with their own metrics and mechanisms to deal with cumulative impacts will provide some additional incentives for the federal EPA to take action. And we know oftentimes this action is slow because of so much potential pushback from industry and from conservatives who basically see any type of strengthening of environmental protection and protection of health as somehow, an attack on jobs. No data, no facts. It's just a way of trying to push something aside and not do what needs to be done in terms of protecting the public and connecting the dots when it comes to all of those impacts that we can assess. We have the science, we have the tools, we have the knowledge to put data together and do what can be defended in terms of the science and the research. It's just a matter of having the EPA to take that step and step out and do it. And we want to, and those of us who are out in communities and representing impacted communities, we hear all the time that our impacted communities want the EPA to make bold, transformative actions and not be timid or shy or basically just business as usual.
Thank you very much.
And I think the emphasis there is on the bold, what Dr. Bullard said, because their EPA now is kind of in a tough spot because New York and New Jersey are setting the standard now. And it could be problematic for other states, or at least from the EJ perspective, if EPA does something that's weaker than New Jersey or New York are doing, right? So EPA really has to step up, because what we don't want to happen is that EPA gets a cumulative impacts policy that's weaker, and then other states are now considering it, like Dr. Bullard says. They say, well, we're not going to go as far as New Jersey and New York because EPA hasn't. And that becomes the benchmark. So we really need them to step up, yes, and do something bold here, and at least at the very least match what New York and New Jersey have done. And I know there are questions there. We all know that's complicated, and they're pouring over legal authority and all of that. But they really have to take a bolder step here. And hopefully what the states have done now, these two states will help them.
Thank you. And speaking of the New Jersey legislation, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what in the New Jersey legislation is really exciting, like what are sort of some of the key pieces of it? And then additionally, what were some of the big concerns that groups had that you had to kind of overcome to make this bill into law?
Well, the real breakthrough there for New Jersey, as it is in New York, is that I think New Jersey was the first law that was adopted that says you should actually turn down permits based on cumulative impacts in EJ. As Peggy and Dr. Bullard said, that's, it's been kind of holy grail of the EJ movement. We have national legislation that said it, but was not adopted, right, from Senator Booker and Representative Grijalva and McEachin, but it wasn't adopted. So in this case, you know, it's actually adopted saying that. And you know, one of the we had to overcome a lot of areas. And let me just say this: one thing that really helped us, we were going to get cumulative impacts in EJ legislation, but one thing that really helped to make it as strong as it is the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, the fact that that movement was going on at the time that the bill was being considered really helped us to get a strong bill. And in particular, we really went back and forth with the state about how you define EJ communities. In the bill, they're called overburdened communities, but we wanted it defined as expansively as possible, whereas there was pushback on trying to define that so it wouldn't be as inclusive. And I think the fact that these other social justice movements were going on, Black Lives Matter movement, really helped us to get a strong bill. I think that, so the regulations that implement the bill, and the bill says you got to do EJ analysis. And I think I said this: if stresses are higher in the community where the permit would be granted than in other communities, then if it's a permit for a new facility, it shall be denied. If it's a permit for a renewal or expand facility, the state can put conditions on it. So of course, the $1 million question is, how are you going to do that analysis? What does higher mean? And we just received the regulations. Well, they first officially came out Monday, and we're still pouring them over. They look good to us. You know, how they're going to decide this. There are a couple of areas that we're looking at closely. There's a compelling public interest exception that we're going to look at very closely. But overall, they seem good. Again, what we're looking for is for this to be implemented. And then we have other ideas about other laws that should be implemented and regulations that should be implemented to reduce pollution in EJ communities. But this will be a significant first step, and hopefully an effective step.
Thank you so much for that description. And we are very excited to have these regulations out because, like you said, it really will help New York get to where they need to go with this legislation as well. And like Dr. Bullard said, if we get one state to do this, another state to do it, as we build up, it's easier as for other states to get this work done because we're already paving that way. So thank you so much.
And I think New York is doing it the right way. I think the New York bill can be stronger than the New Jersey bill, because I think New York bills talk about denial of expansions and renewals. So they've even taken it a step further. If the governor will sign it, which she should do, right? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And so I'd love to ask Peggy and Mychal, as representatives that have been working in 2 New York City neighborhoods for so long, how have you been working towards stopping siting of facilities that might be toxic in the past, and how might this legislation now change the way that work is done?
Well, I think certainly at WEAC, we've been very focused on engaging community residents who are most affected to talk to their elected officials about this and to engage in lobby days in Albany. So I think really beginning to work more with our State Department of Environmental Conservation on these issues. You know, we've had phases of time where we've had a lot of focus on permitting. When we first started the New York Environmental Justice Advisory Board, we had a real strong focus on permitting. We were even looking to be able to bring the Department of Health into having to also approve a permit. And there were a lot of working groups around that, and none of the recommendations were implemented. So I would say that we've got to keep the pressure on the state DEC, ensuring that the New York EJ Advisory Board begins its work with a strong focus on this legislation and how we begin to implement regulations around this. So there's a lot of work for the advocates because we know it's work to get something passed, but the real work is to ensure that it's implemented in the right way and that we can monitor that over the years to ensure that our intentions are being met.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what Peggy just mentioned about the permitting. I mean, we have mobilized participation from our community to be vocal and bring forth comments when these re-permitting processes are underway through the State Department of Environmental Conservation for the peaker plants or the waste transfer stations and all these industries that they are actually the permitting agency for. To make sure our community are aware that we have a voice to be shared. As Peggy mentioned, most oftenly, it doesn't really mean much. They continue to re-permit these facilities and these sources of emissions. But we know we've also know that it's important for our community to be civically engaged, and that we have to make sure our people are able to be a part of this process. And to push the elected officials to push legislation that will change the way this cycle has continued. So, that's been the premise of the focus of our advocacy is getting our community more engaged, more educated on, and stop normalizing the situation as it is, and it's no other way it can be. Our children should not think everyone has asthma in our neighborhood and that's a normal scenario, because it doesn't exist that way in other parts of the city or the state. And so we show them those sources and how they can be civically engaged and how they can be activists and active in these ability and their ability to create the change that's necessary and be the agent of change that's required.
Yeah, and Mychal, you remind me of something that one of the teenagers that we work with said. We work with a training program in a local high school in Washington Heights. And one of the students said after going through our program that she didn't realize that she didn't have to live with the conditions she was living with, whether it's mold, poor air quality. She just thought that, as I think Mychal said, normalized. It was normalized. She didn't know that she could have a role in changing that. And it was just, just so inspiring to realize that just working with the information and working with folks to raise the consciousness that these aren't the conditions that are normal, that they have to live with, and that they really can have a voice in changing. So, I mean, that's just so inspiring. And we have to really focus on raising those issues and that consciousness in our community that's so impacted.
And if I could add another note to that, yeah, I mean, like right now we're working with a local high school and we're doing a STEM project with 60 of their students in collaboration with the Melbourne School of Public Health, the Civic Engagement Court that Peggy helped start at Columbia, where we're actually doing our own creating our own research-driven solutions. When they didn't do that environmental impact statement, they relied on one that was so old, so we did our own people's environmental impact statement. We're measuring our own air, we're counting our own traffic, we're doing it where our children go to school, where our people are living in some of the highest concentration of public housing in the city. So we have to do that, and we show our community by example that we can stand up, fight back, and give ourselves the tools to fight and create different opportunities.
Thank you very much, Peggy and Mychal. Oh,
thanks,
go ahead.
Mychal, for bringing it back to the health issues always too.
Yeah.
Always remind us about that.
Absolutely. For our last question, I'd like to hand it to Dr. Bullard before we go to hopefully a question from the audience. I'll try to sum up some of what people are asking in a question. But Dr. Bullard, if you can talk about how might the New York legislation affect Texas or other states like it? How do you see this legislation paving the way nationally?
Well, let me just say that each and every state that passes a cumulative impact law makes it even a positive step for southern states, because none of our southern states have anything like this. Even though if you look at the possible, the greatest need for something like this in region-wise is probably down here in Dixie. Wrote a book called Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, Environmental Equality 30-something years ago. And that's what we're talking about. So I do think that having New York, New Jersey, and other states pass legislation pushing the federal EPA to pass stringent cumulative impact assessments will trickle down to the South, and the kinds of work that was talking about in terms of citizen science, in terms of having communities trained to do their own analyses and develop their own tools and metrics and methodologies and expertise with community university partnerships can accelerate that. And that's going on right now. We have a little more work to do in terms of our political infrastructure in a place like Texas, but there's a lot of work going on in our blue cities, you know, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, and some other places in Texas that's actually much further along than our state. And I'll leave it at that. We will get there. We may get there a little later, but we will get there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bullard. So thank you to our 4 panelists for talking about the importance of cumulative impacts today. I want to hand the last 2 minutes to a couple questions that I'm seeing in the chat, and I'm trying to sum them up. Just a disclaimer to some of the questions, we don't fully have the answer to a lot of them yet, because some of these questions boil down to the way that the Department of Environmental Conservation creates their rules around this legislation. So for some of the questions asking exactly how the permit application process will work, the jury's still out on that, essentially. So that's my caveat to some of these questions. But one person's asking about public posting and transparency. How do we make sure that the public knows about how this permit process is working? Do any of you have thoughts on how that should best work for New York State or for this type of legislation in general?
I think it should be enhanced. I mean, it's so hard to find out when these projects are up for re-permitting. I mean, we have to really be on top of it, and it's not open and notorious. And I think it's that way for a purpose, right? That they want to go right on through without any speculate or any kind of stipulation or scrutiny from the community, because we have a problem, right? We want clean air. They want to make more money. So it's, yeah, so I that's what I have to say. I think this needs to be more open and notorious. I wish we would have added or had more input on how that should be just easier for community to know what's going on and when these processes are taking place.
Yeah, I also think that as environmental justice groups and as part of the broader environmental community, that we have to do a better job of communications. You know, within probably all of the groups that are sponsoring that, you know, help sponsor that legislation or advocate for it, we all have strong pieces of information that could be better communicated to all of our constituents, all of our neighborhoods. And, you know, part of the issue with us always sort of getting late to the party is that we find out about it at the 11th hour. So I do think that we could come together more as a network of groups working on policy in New York State and really think more about how we could communicate the pieces of information that we have most access to.
Thank you. And just one other question that I've seen in the chat a couple times, if Dr. Sheats, you want to just reiterate a little bit about why the New York bill might be potentially stronger than the New Jersey legislation. What's that difference?
Okay, and I must admit, let me just be transparent. I have had a chance to totally review the New York bill, but in conversation with Sona last night, we talked about it quite a bit. So this is just one area. In the New Jersey bill, if the application is for a new facility and the EJ analysis shows that stress would be higher because of the permit, then the language says that permit shall be denied, which is great, right? We didn't think we would get it that strong, to tell you the truth. Doesn't say may, it says shall. But for renewals and expanded facilities, it says conditions will be placed on it, but not denial. And tell you the truth, at the time, we were happy with that because initially there was nothing in the bill at all about renewals and expansions. But my understanding is the New York bill, as it is now, and I know, possibly could change. I think renewals and expansions are also to be denied in the bill. And just so you know, so in case they want to do something with that, in the two bills on the national level from Senator Booker and the EJ for All Act, and let's check this, I'm going from memory and I'm getting old, renewals in that bill are also be denied under certain circumstances. So, that's consistent. The New York bill's consistent with that.
Great, thank you so much for that clarification. And yes, as we understand it, that is the case for the New York legislation. So I want to say thank you all for joining us today. Do any of the panelists have any final comments that they wanted to make before we close?
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here, being joined by some wonderful environmental justice leaders nationwide to help us celebrate the excitement of this legislation passing in New York State, talk about how it's going to be impactful for us, the country, nationwide. And so thank you all for being here today. And thank you to our attendees for joining in with us. If any of you are want to get involved with our work in cumulative impacts, we have a national level that you can get involved in. And if you're in New York State, you can contact me and I'll put my information in the chat and you can join our coalition that we have that works on finishing this bill and getting it past the finish line. So thank you all so much for joining and have a lovely rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thumbs up, 2 thumbs up. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.